Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
And I'm Jim Manzi, a contributing editor at National Review and a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and a software entrepreneur in my day job.
We're going to talk about your book today, and the title is Uncontrolled, and remind me of the long title.
Uncontrolled, the surprising payoff of trial and error for business, politics, and society. So I passed my first test, which is remembering that title.
Yes. And let's just start off by telling me why you wrote about the book. You know, we've written on the American scene together, and I followed your stuff at National Review and elsewhere, and I've seen you blog about some of these themes at blog post length. But what made you take on the Herculean task of writing a book-length project, and why this one?
Well, why book-length project is pretty easy, which is I felt I had something I wanted to try and say, and it took a book to say it. So I couldn't figure out how to say it in any shorter length than that. The thesis of the book is reasonably complicated in the sense of, X, but this, but this, but this. And so I felt like I took a book. Why this one? Also pretty simple, which is not that I think it is, of all the topics in the world, the most important. It's the one I was pretty sure I knew about, and that I thought needed to be said, that I was in a somewhat unique position to have knowledge of and describe.
Yeah, and I guess if I'm gathering correctly from your writing, part of the impetus for this is you have this idea that America is in a challenging spot or facing challenging times ahead, that right after World War II we were in this dominant position partly because a lot of the rest of the productive world had just had their economy and their physical infrastructure destroyed, and that we've long been facing increasing competition, and we're going to face even more competition in the future. Is that an accurate sketch, or what do you think the challenges to America are coming up?
Yeah, I think that is accurate. The inspiration to write the book was reasonably narrow, and about 12 years ago I started a software company. And for anyone who's ever done a startup part of it, you kind of know how it is. You go down into this dark tunnel where you pretty much ignore everything going on in the world around you and focus on your business, because if you don't, the odds of it dying go from 90% to 99% kind of thing. And around the time of the financial crisis, I was at the point where I was kind of sticking my head back up and doing this, and starting to notice the world around me. And I remember very distinctly seeing economists stand up and with great, with baritone voices, with great certainty, explain what the problem was with the American economy and what we ought to do about it. And if remedy X were applied, it would work. And of course, 10 minutes later, you'd see another guy with a Nobel Prize in economics very confidently saying the opposite. And my reaction to this was, I've just spent 10 years trying to figure out how many Snickers bars ought to go on a convenience store shelf and stuff like that. And that was really hard. And I don't believe you really know as much as you say you know, and that your knowledge is reliable as you claim it to be. So I began talking, monomaniacally about this, and the guy who at the time was running National Review, who's a guy I've known for a long time, said, Jim, you have to stop talking about this and write about these things you're talking about, or at least stop talking about them. So I began a project of writing about this general topic, culminating in writing the book. And I do think that as background to that, the United States is in a position which is pretty tough. Getting the right answers right now is it's always important when you're operating a big country. But I think the stakes are high and are rising, and I've probably spent 25% of my professional career living and working outside the United States, which is kind of sobering. When I listen to a lot of the political debate, it's not so much that I think Team Red or Team Blue is wrong about this issue or that issue, and obviously every coalition has things that any one person's going to disagree with. But it sounds to me like the political dialogue in Washington is it's always 1945 in Washington. There's this kind of lack of connection, I think, to the reality of what's going on in the world, which is the incredible economic and therefore ultimately political and soft power rise of the entire rest of the non-Western world.
in glossing over what you do for a living, you mentioned you'd spend a bunch of time figuring out how many Snickers bars to put on a shelf or how to price them. Give us a little bit deeper insight into the kind of business that you ran and as a background for why you came to this book.
Got it. So I actually started my career in mathematical physics and ended up, through a series of bizarre circumstances, getting pulled into what's called corporate strategy consulting with a firm that was a little spin-off of the Boston Consulting Group, which ultimately got, the time was tiny, it got pretty large and went public and we sold it and so on. And the idea of that industry, and specifically that firm, was to try and use reasonably heavy analytical methods to help corporations develop improved strategies, basically figure out how to make more money. And one of the things that I observed over and over again was whenever we would try and build models which predicted the results of interventions, things like, well, what if we take, I use a lot of retail examples in the book because they're easy to relate to. If I'm a retailer and I want to spend all this money, improving my stores and having better merchandise, it's usually pretty easy to cost it out in advance, but the open question is normally how much more I'm going to sell or what my margin change is going to be, and therefore how profitable this is going to be. And what I discovered over and over again was when you really got into the task of trying to predict how human beings were going to react to something, some kind of business program, it was basically always possible when you were doing this analysis to go deep down into, Excel AC311 in the Excel spreadsheet, or down into a piece of R code, that we can use R at the time, say SAS code, and there'd be some tiny assumption you had to make there. So this is parameter 0.2 or 0.4, and you would kind of, well, I don't know about 0.2, and it would turn out that, when it was 0.2, the program looked great, and if that assumption was 0.4, the program looked bad. There's always this kind of model tuning going on down in the depths of these analyses. And what people other than me hit upon as a solution to figure out, well, how would people really respond to something like, our search is going to be red now instead of blue, or we're going to keep them open later, or we're going to invest to improve them, or we're going to change prices, et cetera, was just, again, to take a retail example, just go to 20 stores and change the price and see what happened. And it turns out that, and see what happened is pretty tricky, particularly when you're in an environment of relatively smaller sample sizes, like not a direct mail solicitation for a credit card where I can pick 20,000 people and give them a different offer, but as an example I gave you, I want to paint stores different colors so I can pick 20. It turns out there's some reasonably hairy mathematical problems involved in designing and interpreting those experiments. And in 1999, a couple of friends and I started a software company designed to build software to allow large companies to design and interpret experiments like that. And at this point, think about a third of major U.S. retail, for example, is on our system. We're tracking at a very detailed level exactly what's going on, and they're using this technology to design and interpret experiments to answer questions about how do human beings really respond to interventions.
Right, and so am I correct in saying that one of the ways that this software is helping me if I'm a business that wants to do an experiment is that it's basically preventing me from or making it easier for me to do an experiment and not mistaking the results of it?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
And so for people who are completely unfamiliar with your book, a short version of it is that you want to apply this insight to the world of social science and to public policy. In making the argument for why we should do this, you actually begin the book with a long account of a sort of history of knowledge and science and the rise of the experimental revolution in science. Why did you think it was important to go beyond your experience in business and what you learned there and sort of trace back through all of that?
Well, a lot of people ask me that question, and I think it's basically a case of pay me now or pay me later. I think I found myself going all the way back to the foundations of probability theory and the philosophy of science in trying to answer the questions, the commercial questions that we're talking about. And I think if you are serious about answering the question, well, how do I know that I've discovered a cause and effect or causal relationship between some intervention and some outcome, you are inevitably led all the way back to philosophy of science.
So one thing that I want to press you on is this tension that has always existed among different camps of libertarians between Hayek and Rothbard is one way of looking at it. Hayek had this argument that the reason that we need liberty is basically because, among other reasons, it allows society to progress. It's a very utilitarian argument. The idea is that we need to preserve the ability of people to use trial and error, and it's important to have this conservative received wisdom and to go along with institutions that have existed for a long time because we don't understand some of the wisdom, but it's also important that people be able to experiment, and that kind of freedom is how we innovate and how we make advances. And there's this other strain of libertarianism that would critique Hayek and that would say, well, no, we need liberty because we have these natural rights, and no one has the right to tell us, no, you're not allowed to do this. You make the case in your book that actually, at least at the local level, localities shouldn't be able to enslave people. They shouldn't be able to prevent people from leaving a jurisdiction. But within jurisdictions, there should be pretty wide latitude for what you're allowed to legislate, even if it's liberty reducing. And maybe you should make the argument for that before I take it on.
Right. Without trying to go through the history of libertarian thought in the book, I draw the distinction I call liberty as means and liberty as goal, which is essentially liberty as means is what you mean by the Hayekian tradition, and liberty as goal by the Rothbardian tradition. It's kind of like, if you ever use a telescope, you have kind of the big wheel that kind of gets you into general focus, and then the little wheel that gets you to more precisely focus on items. The way I think about it is the kind of rights-based philosophical tradition is sort of setting some very broad boundaries on what we would do. We wouldn't want slavery and so on. And I think that when it comes to most of the practical questions where this is applied in modern advanced democracy political life, should prostitution be legal in Nevada? Should localities have the right to institute the following kinds of zoning regulations, etc.? It's basically, I don't think, useful because we're operating between the 45 and 55 yard line in the grand scheme of should human beings be enslaved or not. And I think that it's not practical to reason from a view of rights to address those questions. You can, obviously, people do it. I don't think it's very useful. I don't think that the kinds of things we're talking about in a place like the United States or France or wherever violate those norms to an extent that you need to invoke these kinds of natural rights, and that therefore we should have a correct understanding of the intellectual underpinnings of what I think of as libertarianism, lead us to have humility about our knowledge and allow local groups of people who want to try and live one way versus another to do that if that's what they want to do.
Yeah, and it certainly the Hayekian tradition certainly appeals to me greatly in theory and may well be correct. One thing though that I see as I sort of survey the United States and the local legislation that persists in different places, it seems to me that there's actually a failure to learn from one jurisdiction to another. It doesn't seem to me that one jurisdiction is trying one thing and another is trying another thing, and they all look around and say, oh, that seems to be working, we'll do that. One example are liquor laws. It seems to me that in various places in the United States, liquor laws exist for no good reason. And I don't just mean blue laws where you can't sell on Sunday, something that I find ridiculous, but that people in a different community might have religious reasons for that and want to institute their community preference, and that's a different question. But what I mean is New York deciding that wine can only be sold in these places and beer can only be sold in these other places in New York City, and LA having a completely different system that is more free in some ways and less free in other ways. And you look at the ways that they're least restricted, and there doesn't seem to be any apparent reason to the restrictions because things seem to work elsewhere. Another example of the Institute for Justice just put out this big report on professional licensing. and the different states that license different occupations. And there's just wide divergence among the states. Some states, for example, you have to get a license to become an interior designer. Other states, you don't have to get a license to become an interior designer. And there doesn't really seem to be any, interior designers don't seem to perform better in the states where you need a license.
Right. But think of the safety concerns of having an unlicensed interior designer, right? I mean, they might put a step in where you can trip and hurt yourself.
And these kinds of things seem to challenge the idea that we're learning, and what someone from the Institute for Justice might say is, shouldn't you have the right to make a living in the way that you choose? And if we can come in and litigate this and get the courts to recognize this right, isn't that a liberty-enhancing thing? Can't you, in fact, experiment more in those same jurisdictions in some ways because people are more free? So,
let's see. There's not a simple answer to this question. So here's the way I think about it. I spent a lot of time in the book early on talking about the mechanics of genetic evolution to make some points about how it works. And one of the observations I make is it is glacial, statistical, and crude. So we want to jump past the long glacial requirements of evolution where we can build explicit knowledge. It's just that it's very hard to build explicit knowledge. And I think it is hard, not easy, to know the full, all-in, long-term effects of, say, to take what seems to you, I think, and definitely to me, a ridiculous law that is probably pure rent-seeking, which is licensing interior decorators. It's hard to see what productive purpose it serves, but hard to see and not true are two different things. And so I think we ought to have a strong bias to allow localities to implement things that we think are stupid, because I go through lots of examples of business of allowing people to do things we think are stupid. It is central to innovation occurring. Now, I think that where we can build explicit knowledge, we can build national rules where we say, look, let's hypothetically say we run tons and tons of experiments, and we've just proven over and over again, even accepting heuristics we have to use to interpret experimental results and so on. We now have an absolute national consensus that licensing interior designers is a really bad idea. We can pass a law like that. What I'd say is, if we do pass such a law, we ought to allow localities, states, and so on to have waivers from that law. So in other words, if a particular state says, look, okay, there's a law now that says you cannot license interior designers, we actually think here in Alabama or California or Alaska or wherever, but we think it'd be a good idea to do that we should have a very strong bias, even when we have a national law, to allow them to have a waiver, but to demand a structured experiment that says, okay, you can have the waiver, but when you get the waiver, you need to run an experiment to measure as feasibly as possible the effects of that change. So I don't have a kind of absolute answer to your question, but really a kind of a predisposition or orientation, which is we should be very hesitant to go into localities and have national uniform rules about things like, should interior designers be regulated? And even where we ultimately do that, as we're going to do in some cases, we should have a strong predisposition to grant waivers with a quid pro quo being running experiments. That is actually how welfare reform happened, was exactly that process. And I think it's a model for, in a crude and simple way, a model for what we might do.
Do you have a view about whether we ought to be conducting experiments that take advantage of comparisons at the international level?
I think there's, if you think about, in the simplest way, if you think about real experiments in social science areas requiring random assignment, unless we have a UN backed by an army which can randomly assign some countries to some treatments and other countries to control, those aren't really experiments. One of the things you see I've seen in businesses over and over and over again is once an experimental capability is put in place, everyone in the world wants to call everything an experiment because the word now carries power and authority. And so this idea, we have the use loose of the term is an outcome of people valuing it, and calling quote-unquote natural experiments or changes in some places and not others experiments is a rhetorical move. And I go through a number of examples of quote-unquote natural experiments showing why, in general, they do not allow the same kind of identification of causal mechanism that real experiments do. There will be exceptions. There are some natural experiments that are reasonable approximations, but in general, it's very difficult to draw conclusions from them.
Are you a fan of the educational testing movement? The idea that tests should be used to measure everything from teacher performance to curriculum to all of the rest of it?
Well, I mean, to take the case of, say, value-added testing, using tests to measure the quote-unquote value-added features, which is, in rough terms, you take the students in class at the beginning of the year, how do they do on standardized tests? You take their performance at the end of the year, you call that value-added and assign it to the teacher. I think that, on one hand, teaching is not some completely unique activity, totally different than any other job. It exists in the economy that happens by a million people. And I think every job ought to involve some kind of measurement of performance and feedback, and the measurement of performance ought to be consequences, positive and negative. That said, I think that this kind of crazy academic notion that we're going to build this unitary measure and it's value added, and by the way, we get into the details of it, it's not like, well, I took their English scores at the end of the year and subtracted from the beginning of the year, their math scores at the end of the year and subtracted from their scores at the beginning of the year, and I add those two numbers and I call it the value added. It's this huge, complicated regression whose purpose it is to try and hold constant a huge number of complicating factors. And I've actually seen businesses try and put exactly these kinds of systems in place over and over again for, say, store manager. I've got 1,000 store managers to do the same thing. I've got 16,000 people in my sales force to do the same thing. How do I hold constant the territory you're given or store you're given or whatever and measure your performance? And what inevitably happens is this huge headquarters exercise. And over the first year, the person who runs operations muscles it through, and there's just a complete revolt when the people who are being evaluated say, well, wait a second, you discover these guys become like Aristotle in determining these differences between themselves and other folks. And inevitably it falls apart because those models can never reflect the complexity of the world. And so I think on one hand, teachers ought to be evaluated, and one element of that ought to be, how are the people in your class doing on some standardized tests or running standardized tests. But I think that those measurement systems have to be broader. They have to be what's called a balanced scorecard. They probably mostly ought to emphasize other things, and they really only work in the presence of a kind of functional organization with some alignment around goals, rather than being, this idea that you're going to have this external scientists come in and measure the performance of these people in the context of an organization. I think that's an academic conceit.
As we've discussed, you have a very successful day job, and you write on the side for various publications. And now you've got this book. Who are you writing for? When you wrote this book, who is the audience that you were trying to put your argument to? Who are you imagining reading it?
Well, it's a great question. I basically wrote it for people who I think are frustrated by superficiality. I think that really anyone who wants to get to the bottom of how is it that we know or do not know, we claim to know, about policies that involve human beings is really the audience. So that's kind of a weird definition of the audience. It's not really kind of, policymakers or academics or business people. It's that kind of person in any one of those groups and other groups.
It certainly helps explain why your arguments are so carefully and responsibly hedged, and in that way very different from most policy books you read.
Well, and hence, I'm sure it's as my publisher put it when I described that idea of an audience, well, that's pretty narrow. I think that I wrote it. You have to make a decision. Am I writing this to say what I think, or am I writing this to, have a large audience? And each of those is very hard to do, by the way, of course. And really, I try to write what I think is the case, what I think is true. And the only reason I wrote it is that I thought it was correct. As you say, I put real tight boundaries around what I'm saying. But inside that circle, the subject of those qualifications, I'm pretty sure I'm right. I think it matters. When you really think through the issue, I think the thing I'm saying matters, and then see anybody else saying it.
And I think the people who have liked the book have become evangelists for it. David Brooks wrote a very nice column about it.
Right.
And it's been well reviewed in at least in all of the reviews that I've read.
Right.
And the one that I wrote. I wonder. It seems like the people who have reviewed it well share this notion that the fact that maybe it works is the thing that matters. Grab my computer. Mostly when I read reviews of political books, that isn't the thing that the people writing reviews about them on the right or the left are interested in. They're interested in, I suppose, does this contribute a frame through which I can press my ideological advantage, or does this explicate a preconception of my ideology in a particularly novel way? Is it ammunition, I guess, in one way or another, to put it more simply? And I wonder if there is sufficient incentive to implement a system just because it works anymore. Or maybe if there ever was. I don't know. And I don't know if you even have a view about that. Maybe you just laid it out because you thought it works, and that was enough. But having written it and having fielded private responses as well as public, do you have a sense of that?
Well, there's two parts, I guess, to your question. So the first part in terms of people's reactions, reviewers' reactions, when I was doing consulting, we were doing very data-driven analytical consulting, and our view was we're going to do analysis and we're going to find answers, and we're not going to presuppose the answer. And so we call the axiom of consulting for us, which is your enemies will be your friends and your friends will be your enemies. And what we meant by that is when you show up on the first day and you meet some executives and there'll be guys who are slapping your backs and being your friends, and the other guys sit at the table with their arms folded, sort of feeling like, I've seen like a 10,000 consultants go through and they're all kind of full of crap and, whatever. Inevitably, by the end of the work we did, the first group of guys hated us and the second group of guys liked us. And the reason was because we really weren't coming in, quote unquote, knowing an answer and kind of justifying it. We were saying we're doing some analysis, getting an answer. And I think that that's been kind of my observation of how people have viewed it, which is that there's been a huge selection bias in terms of who's actually dragged themselves through this kind of semi-technical book. And it's people who are interested in, the guys with their arms folded across their chest are kind of the smart, cynical guys. And I think in general they have, from Mother Jones on the left and National Review on the right, and the specific people who are viewing it, I think, are like that, who are smart and analytical and, really are, have their ideological predispositions just like I do, but fundamentally are reasonably pragmatic about making decisions with information. Having people who have found it congenial. Is it actually something that can be practically done? Yeah, I think so. I've seen it done in huge organizations, huge commercial organizations. I've described it. I've seen it transform the medical profession, which had the exact same sources of resistance we're describing here 100 years ago. And I've seen it used, I've observed it used and written about in the book, it being used in major departments of the United States government and governments elsewhere. So I think there's good evidence, actually, that it can be implemented. And as I try to emphasize literally in the introduction of the book and in the last page of the book, I don't have medicine I'm selling here that I'm saying is going to, make blind people see. What I have is medicine that, can allow us to get just a little bit better about certain decisions. When you get past all this sort of political philosophy that people always want to get into and so on, as a practical matter, the United States government is going to run, at various levels, is going to run many thousands of schools and police jurisdictions and welfare offices and so on. And I think if we have an orientation that says, as we continue to try to probe those with people with ideas, our response ought to be, all right, that sounds like a reasonable enough response. Why don't you go try it in some schools and we'll see what happens. I think that's a pretty practical thing.
Within that hedged circle of argument where you're pretty sure that you're right, who are your sharpest critics? Who are the people where you found yourself really struggling to counter their objections, or what you imagine their objections would be?
It's a great question. I always, for a long time anyway, had the point of view that whenever I have a non-obvious point of view on a subject, go find the person who I think is the smartest single person who has really thought about the issue and thinks I'm completely full of it, and listen very carefully to what they say. And the book, I spent all the time, or a decent amount of time, a guy named James Heckman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, who, if you were to find a guy who says, basically all this randomized controlled trial stuff, and I'm caricaturing his views, which are he's brilliant, all this randomized controlled trial stuff is it's way overblown, and really it doesn't solve the problems it claims it solves. I say it's James Heckman, and I go through several of his papers and monographs and so on he's written, and basically make the observation that every one of his objections, at least the ones that I go through, are correct. And that what they all boil down to is this problem of various manifestations of this problem of generalization, or what people here call external validity, which is, when I run an experiment, what I really know is, take a medical experiment, this chemical injected by these doctors into this list of named patients at these clinics on the following calendar day had this effect. But what I really need to answer is, when I put a chemical a lot like that injected into other people on other calendar days, what will happen? And as you get into social science, this problem of generalization is really the central intellectual issue you wrestle with once you've built the engineering capacity to run well-designed experiments. And one of many sources of the hedging is really accepting this issue of the problem of generalization is eternal and fundamental. And in fact, it helped me, his writing helped me to systematize a lot of the things we've observed in businesses trying to use experiments.
Is there any experiment, and I know you're making a general case here that's part of the point, that you want to apply this widely and systematically to a whole range of problems, and you don't know which of them will turn out to be useful and most of them won't. Despite all that hedging, is there any experiment or any policy area where you would just be curious to run some particular thing? Given the means.
I mean, my view is that the short answer to your question is no. And the reason the answer is no is this observation that there aren't silver bullets. That, in fact, we need to build a mountain of pebbles. When you want to address a big problem, it is almost never the case that you're like, oh, if only we had nurse visitation to expect it in young mothers. Now we're going to solve this problem. Or school choice is simply going to solve the problem of public schools in the United States. It just never works that way. And so what I'd say is the policy area where I think there's probably the greatest leverage right now is K through 12 education. And we are now starting to do lots more experiments, but it's mind-blowing, the lack of experimentation that happened during many, many decades. And I think ultimately is due to this problem of politics. I mean, it's not random in my opinion. This is only a judgment that we had so many more experiments among, prisoners and welfare recipients rather than among, parents of children in school, because the second group has a lot more political power than the first two groups.
Right. But at the same time, prisoners, welfare recipients, and school children all seem to be groups that lend themselves to the sort of thing you want to do, just because they are captive populations in a sense, and they're also populations that are the subject of policies that basically everyone agrees that the federal government should be doing it somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, they're in institutional settings where you have lots of replications of units of analysis, which are less sort of jargony terms. There are a lot of schools. It's an institutional setting where we have tons and tons of schools, we have tons and tons of welfare offices, and so on. And I agree with you, that makes it much more practical to do these kinds of things. It also means, of course, it's where we spend gigantic amounts of money and effort. K-12 education is like 4% of American GDP. It's a gigantic industry. That's one example.
Well, we are about out of time, but I enjoyed the conversation. I wish you well with the book, and I hope I see it reviewed lots more places.
Great. Thanks very much for spending the time today.